Hi Internet, my name's Ewan McGaughey, Senior Lecturer in Law. I work in Corporate Governance, and I want to talk to you about one of the big themes at this election, which is whether or not in the 21st century we are going to have a true democracy. One of the big problems today is that we've got a sort of more or less democratic politics. We all kind of understand how that works. It's one person, one vote, and we elect a parliament and hopefully they do what we want them to do. But then in the economy we see something much closer to an autocracy. And that's because most of the votes in the economy are controlled by big financial institutions, mainly asset managers and banks. So what happens is that most of us work and save for retirement through pension funds, through life insurance policies, mutual funds, and that money works its way into the stock market and into the shares of big companies. And those big companies control so many aspects of our lives. We might work for them so that they set our pay, they set investment levels, whether regions are thriving or deprived, they affect our environment, they affect the gender pay gap, they affect so many aspects of our lives. And so it's important to see how the votes in those companies are shared. But unfortunately, big financial institutions, asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Legal & General, Prudential, AXA, Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, you name it. They all control the voting rights on company shares, and mostly with other people's money and with very little accountability. So there's three big issues. Which is whether votes are going to be shared fairly at work. Second of all, if we get votes in our capital. And thirdly, if we get votes in more accountable public services. Now, at this election, there are two main issues that have emerged in the party manifestos. The first is whether or not we have the right to vote for the boss, and particularly on big company boards. And second of all, if we get a fair share of the profits that our workplaces make, particularly through what are now being called inclusive ownership funds. So let's take a look at the party manifestos. So what do the party manifestos say, starting with Labour on this question of having a more democratic economy? Well, in votes at work, Labour says on page 64, we will require 1/3 of boards to be reserved for elected worker directors and give them more control over executive pay. Of course, referring there to the fact that executive pay for the top companies has been going up and up and up, sometimes 200 or 300 times the pay of the average worker, while everybody else's pay has been stagnating. So significantly more votes at work. And then also on page 60, Labour says we will give workers a stake in the companies that they work for through setting up inclusive ownership funds. So that means that workers will also get a vote at work of up to 10% of a company. It says also, to quote, that the workers will get a share of the profits that they help to create, and again up to 10% of a company, and the profits will be capped at £500 a year, so a £500 pay rise for everyone at a company, and the surplus will go to a climate apprenticeship fund, which will be invested in green jobs, getting to a zero carbon economy and the jobs of the future. Labour also wants to democratise capital through a reform on page 63 by amending the Companies Act and requiring companies to prioritise long-term growth with more protections for various stakeholders, including pension funds. And one of the really important issues there is whether pension funds can take the rights on behalf of the workers that they represent in asset management. So that's votes at work and votes in capital. Now, what about democratising public services? Well, Labour says it wants rail, energy, water, more bus networks in public ownership, deprivatise schools, deprivatise the NHS. And just one example of what the plans seem to be for democratisation on page 39 is that Labour says that it wants to have elected representatives in schools. So that is the Labour Party. So what does the Conservative Party say about democratising the economy? Here's that manifesto. There's Mr. Johnson saying, get Brexit done. But there's nothing in here about votes at work, votes in capital, or more accountable public services, which is strange, given that it's abandoned the promise that Theresa May made in 2016 when she said that workers would have a right to vote for company boards and that consumers could as well. What about the Liberal Democrats? So they do have two policies on pages 21 and 22. First, they say in all companies with over 250 employees, there should be at least one employee representative on their boards with the same legal duties and responsibilities as other directors. Not necessarily the same rights, it seems. So the Liberal Democrats there are very far behind the European Union standard, which tends to be 1/3 on boards, which is also what the Labour Party is proposing. They also have this policy on page 21, which says in companies with more than 250 employees, there will be a right to request shares in that company. Not a right to get shares, so your boss could just say, no, I don't want to give them to you. But that policy is potentially very problematic because if a company goes bust, employees with shares and they're not in a diversified fund could not only lose their jobs, but also lose their savings, just like the disastrous Enron bankruptcy in America in the early 2000s. So potentially a very damaging policy there from the Liberal Democrats for employee welfare. Then there's the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage, although he's not running as an MP, trying to look tough. They don't have anything, just Brexit stuff. Then there is the Green Party, if not now, when? Good question. The Greens do have public ownership policies. They want to deprivatise the NHS. They want to bring rail back into public ownership, but only over 10 years. But there's not really anything about getting more voice at work for workers, or in capital, or in other public services. So if you want to democratise the economy, that's the one.